Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. To all of you who are here with us today. Some of you, it's late. Some of you, it's very early. So thank you so much. My name is Diana Rango. I'm a global lead for gender-based violence, and I sit within the gender group at the World Bank. And it's it's an honor to be with you all today to talk about gender-based violence and disaster risk management. This event that we'll be participating in for the next hour and a half will be jointly hosted, or is being jointly hosted, by the Gender Group's GBV Community of Practice and the Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practices Inclusive Disaster Risk Management Initiative, which is quite a mouthful. But we're so happy to have partnered with this group to talk about GBV and disaster risk management. And we're very lucky to be joined today by two global directors to give us some opening remarks. We will hear first from Sameh Wabat, who is the global director for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practice. And following Sameh, we'll have Hannah Brixey, that leads the gender group at the World Bank as the global director. So again, welcome everyone. We're very excited for the discussion. And Sameh, over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you out there. And thank you very much for joining us for this really important event. Now, we all know that disasters are not gender neutral. I mean, they often affect women and girls disproportionately more than men and boys due to gender inequalities, of course, which are themselves caused by socioeconomic conditions, cultural beliefs, traditional practices, etc. So understanding the different gender roles and responsibilities, the needs, the capacities is critical for us to identify, to reduce, to prepare, and to respond to disasters for an effective disaster risk management, and to better understand how we can best support women and girls as their own advocates and their agents of change. Now, a recent report by GFDRR, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, on gender responsive disaster preparedness and recovery in the Caribbean found that in emergency settings, women and girls are at a greater risk of experiencing physical and sexual violence. So during a disaster, in addition to the direct harm that can be caused, GBV can also prevent women and girls from accessing services or securing shelter and safe spaces during an emergency, which further increases their likelihood of injury or death. It can also impact women's ability to access aid and other resources that might be available during reconstruction and recovery. So it is really vital for disaster risk management interventions to include measures to prevent and effectively respond to gender-based violence. Of course, at the World Bank, we're committed to addressing gender-based violence through our investments, our advisory and analytical work, the knowledge exchange, the collaboration with different stakeholders around the world. And today is particularly important for us to have an opportunity to learn, to discuss what could be practical and actionable opportunities for GBV risk mitigation, prevention, and response, hearing from World Bank teams, from USAID, and from UNFPA. So with that, let me pass it on to Hannah. Thanks a lot, Hannah, for this joint collaboration. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Sameh, and very warm welcome to you all here. We all know that women and men and girls and boys experience disasters and more broadly the impact of climate change differently. And that gender inequalities influence the capacity to recover from disasters and also resilience to shocks. Emerging evidence shows that gender-based violence, as Sameh indicated, is exacerbated at times of crisis, that violence tends to increase in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, that during the emergency, women and children are at greater risk of physical, sexual, and intimate partner violence, and that the risk of disaster-related gender-based violence could last years after the disaster has taken place. Displacement that is often related to disasters also increases the vulnerability of women and girls in their day-to-day life. Studies, and there is an emerging number of studies that document the increased level of sexual violence and coerced prostitution for food and benefits in shelters. So for example, in Colombia and Liberia, women who experienced forced displacement were between 40 to 55% more likely to experience violence in their lifetime. In the United States, a study in post-Hurricane Katrina environment found the prolonged nature of disaster-led impact, and the rate of new cases of violence against women and girls among displaced women increased and did not return to the pre-hurricane baseline during the protracted phase of displacement. And as we know also, gender-based violence does not only cause direct physical and psychological harm, it can also prevent women and girls from accessing a wide range of services, and not only during emergency, but also in its aftermath. And one of the panelists, Naraya, leads a very impactful and valuable project that seeks to facilitate women's access to shelters in Haiti and access to a wide range of services. And we will learn from her what the World Bank can do also to address such issues. Now, as we know, gender-based violence is the most pressing of gender inequality. It affects 1 in 3 women globally based on WHO measurement. And we also have data indicating that gender-based violence has expanded, unfortunately, also following the outbreak of COVID-19. Now, every sector and every region has a powerful role to play in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. And the disaster risk management and climate resilient projects can contribute and can really make a big difference in these efforts. So just to give you 2 examples before closing, as part of preparedness and mitigation measures, projects can include gender-based violence prevention and response strategies in disaster contingency plans and preparedness strategies. And they can also strengthen the capacity of disaster response actors at the regional and national levels, giving them the tools and the knowledge they need to appropriately mitigate and respond to gender-based violence in the midst of climate crisis. Another example, as part of response and recovery measures, the bank can help countries and is helping countries along with other partners to facilitate multi-sectoral coordination at national and local levels to effectively respond to gender-based violence during and after the crisis. And projects help promote physical safety of women and girls by ensuring the international agreed upon standards for shelters and safe spaces, as well as the availability of female protection or police officers and female staff for food distribution, registration, and other services. So there are many promising interventions, and we will learn about a number of those today in the discussions. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion and to our continuing engagement and partnerships in this area. Thank you, and over to Diana.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Sameh, for those opening remarks and inspiring words, and really to remind us that the World Bank has a role to play in addressing gender-based violence and disaster risk management. It's a topic that we're engaging in more and more, and having GBV as a core element of what we address in our DRM projects is exciting. It's exciting to think about. So thank you so much, both of you, for your inspiring words. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mirai Mauro, a gender specialist in the gender group. She is going to share with us the importance of addressing gender-based violence in disaster risk operations. So Mirai, over to you.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. I am here today to make a very brief presentation about why it is important and very relevant for us to be addressing GBV through the DRM project and how we can do so very effectively and meaningfully. So we have heard from Sam and Hannah why we are addressing GBV. It's very clear that GBV is a manifestation of gender inequality and a means to sustain that unequal power imbalance between men and women. So preventing GBV is part of our effort to address gender inequality. And worldwide, 1 in 3 women in their lifetime have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner or sexual violence by a non-partner. And that really shows that this GBV is happening anywhere and everywhere. GBV, that negative impact that GBV can cause stands in a way for us to achieve gender equality as well as our development objectives. GBV's devastating impact for survivors of violence and their families is not the only thing that stands there. It's also a social and economic cost that GBV brings. In some countries, the GBV is estimated to cost them up to 3.7% of the GDP. So there's a significant thing to address GBV. Both Same and Hannah also touched on it, but there's a growing evidence that emergencies exacerbate GBV, and its consequences can last even after years of event has taken place. And as DRM project, you're supporting countries and governments before, during, and post-disaster settings. Addressing GBV is a relevant action to take. With all the negative things I've mentioned, one positive thing is that GBV is preventable. And these negative effects that I've mentioned can be contained by addressing its drivers through a multi-sectoral approach. So each and every sector has a role to play, and the bank is emerging to do so, to play a role in eliminating gender-based violence. And this is just a snapshot of evidence. Some Hannah has already mentioned, but just to show how GBV is exacerbated during and post-emergency settings. And I won't be going over each of them, but here I just wanted to make 2 points that GBV can take place in all society, all cultures, regardless of the income level of a country. And different forms of violence can take place during and post-emergency settings, like intimate partner violence, rape and sexual assault, sexual exploitation, child marriage, and the like. And as Hannah and Sami has mentioned, it is not only the direct harm caused by violent act. GBV also keep women and girls from accessing services or shelters during this very hard period of time of emergency and recovery phases. So the question is, what can we do? How can we contribute to the efforts to prevent and respond to GBV? Well, there are different measures you can take at policy levels, at the institutional sectoral levels, and at the community levels. Hannah has already mentioned some, but if the project is focusing on the preparedness, for example, then you can help the government to integrate GBV prevention and response in DRM protocols and guidelines. And capacity building, Hannah has already mentioned, can be just integrated into normal sectoral training that might already exist. So it is not about creating something bigger. If you already have a project, by making a little tweaks and having that recognition of the GBV issues and making a tweaks can make a difference. If your project is focused on response and recovery stage actions, then the project could also help integrate GBV expertise in line ministries and local governments. It's important that someone who understands this issue is part of the discussion process. It is also something you can think is supporting distribution of dignity kits and safety equipment. though we have to be mindful of the distribution point so as to avoid that this could potentially increase the risk of sexual exploitation. Project can also support the provision of psychosocial support or facilitate survivors' access to such support, such services. This is actually what the government of Nicaragua has done in the post-Hurricane Mitch period to provide psychosocial support for the survivors of violence, even years after the hurricane event has taken place. So there are various things you can do that I cannot mention here, but this picture that you can see is a violence against women and girls resource guide on the DRM sector brief that the World Bank has developed in partnership with IDB and many other partners. And it has a whole list of entry points you could consider. DRM project has a important role to play. And it's not that it is something very new for you to do. There are already local expertise and organizations working in the field. So you can partner with them and make together we can make a difference. For the bank colleagues, the global GBV team is providing technical support for the teams to integrate actions to prevent and respond to GBV. So please reach out to us. And that's it for my presentation. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Mariah. That was great. The other partners of our resource guide are the Global Women's Institute and ICRW. And we hope that that's a useful resource for everyone. Ariana, hopefully you can put a link to the Violence Against Women and Girls resource guide in the chat. Now we have a super exciting panel with experts internally to the World Bank, internal to the World Bank, and from USAID and UNFPA. We're super excited to have you all with us. I'm going to introduce you quickly and then move on to some questions and answers for you. So first we have Chaitra Shanoy, who is the Senior GBV Advisor and Team Lead at USAID. She is an attorney and a technical expert in the field of gender-based violence, and since 2016, she has worked at USAID providing guidance on programming, addressing gaps, and determining trends for research on gender-based violence in her capacity as the gender-based violence advisor. So we'll turn to you, I think, last in the discussion, but welcome and thank you for being with us. We also have our partner from UNFPA. I feel like it's like my ex alma mater, but I guess you don't like go to a UN agency. But Alex Robinson is a GBV technical specialist at UNFPA. She works as the global GBV advisor for the Gender and Human Rights branch at UNFPA headquarters. She comes with almost a decade of experience with UNFPA in the Pacific region, as well as Myanmar, working to design and implement programs to end gender-based violence in humanitarian, peace building, and development settings. So Alex, thank you so much for being with us. It's great to have both UNFPA and USAID, our partners on the ground, and hopefully building partnerships here within this event for work moving forward on the intersection between GBV and disaster risk management and climate change. And internally from the bank, we have John Boone, a senior disaster risk management specialist that sits in the East Asia and Pacific regions in urban disaster risk management, resilience, and land global practice. He works on lending and analytical activities related to disaster risk management, risk-informed urban planning, disaster risk financing, and social inclusion. John, welcome. I know it's late for you, but we're super happy that you're with us. And finally, but not least of all, we have Naraya Carrasco, Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist. Naraya joined the Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice in 2020. She's based in Haiti to focus on DRM and urban development programs there. So we're going to have a great conversation with you all. All of you online joining us, please enter your questions for any of our panelists in the chat as we go along. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. But John, since it's late where you are, let's start with you. You are leading the Central Sulawesi Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Project. that has high risk of GBV in a post-disaster setting. And I understand that the project aims to develop a strategy to prevent GBV and promote safe design of relocation sites and public facilities. So could you tell us a little bit about the progress made on this front? Any lessons that you've learned on how to work on integrating GBV into a DRM project managed and financed by the World Bank? And then I understand kind of that the entry point for this project was to mitigate the risks on gender-based violence in Indonesia. Has that led to any opening to talk about GBV in the community more broadly with your counterpart? Those are two important lessons for us to learn from you. So over to you.
Absolutely, Deanna, and thanks so much for having me on the panel. I'm really excited to be here. And I would preface my comments by saying that I'm not an expert on GBV at all. I would say I'm a champion for gender inclusion. I'm helping to facilitate knowledge exchange on gender-based violence risk mitigation on our projects in East Asia and the Pacific. And I'm really excited to hear more from the other speakers today. Maybe Deanna and others, I can just give a little bit of quick context on Central Sulawesi. So, as we've heard from the opening remarks that absolutely, GBV risk is exacerbated in post-disaster situations. And this was exactly our concern, 3.5 years ago when the earthquake and tsunami struck Central Sulawesi. Central Sulawesi is already, has a lot of history of social conflict and violence against women and girls in the past. So we were quite concerned. And as the bank, was preparing the Central Sulawesi rehabilitation and reconstruction project with the government of Indonesia, this was actually, one of the first emergency recovery operations in the entire world that we were preparing against the World Bank's environmental and social framework. And so knowledge and experience, even internally for us and operationally for gender-based violence risk mitigation 3.5 years ago was still quite limited. And we were actually really glad to be able to partner with NGOs in the field, such as UNFPA. As we know, the UN agencies are the ones first on the ground, helping, distribute, hygiene kits and supporting women in the field. And so our role was more the longer term support. So Deanna, one of the first things we really wanted to consider was not just the, a reactive approach to, GBV risk mitigation. We wanted to build in gender inclusion and GBV risk mitigation into the project design. So a key consideration we built in was to, look at how to design safer housing, safer public facilities. That's the key of what we're supporting in Central Sulawesi, the reconstruction of housing and public facilities. So we worked with the Ministry of Public Works and Housing. We developed universal accessibility guidelines, gender audits. We did some training on gender inclusion audits in schools and public spaces. And we worked with the government to identify design ideas and practices, for the design and construction of this infrastructure to ensure that in the future, when these buildings, as they are now starting to become reconstructed, they actually help to mitigate gender-based violence. They help to make women, girls, children, and therefore all people feel safer in these spaces. But I think we also cannot, forget the serious, need to mitigate gender-based violence in these post-disaster situations. We have got here 6 good practices that we've helped to adopt within the project. I won't go through each of them in detail. I would say that a couple of the key ones we really have to continue working with the government is particularly on the contractor and consultant training. So as with any post-disaster recovery program, there are a huge number of both consultants and civil works contractors and their subcontractors that are coming into the field. And often this labor influx is, one of the issues that can increase the risk of GBV incidents in the field. So we've continuously provided a training and workshops for these project workers. We've required them to sign codes of conduct as per our environmental and social framework. And the challenge is that, this is a large project. It's a $160 million project. So we are seeing multiple consulting firms and contractors come in and out of Central Sulawesi. So we're continuously needing to remind the project workers particularly through the GBV focal point that has been established in the ministry to continuously provide this training. I think I'll stop there because I think we're short on time, but I'm happy to answer more questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, John, and thanks for showing us that even kind of complying with our ESF standards is important, but gives us the opportunity to potentially go a bit beyond, and the importance of partnering with actors who are on the ground like UNFPA. But also, I love your point on the slide of building collaboration with local government and local service providers, because I do think that we aren't acting in this space alone. And so that partnership that would lead to sustainability in addressing kind of GBV in a quality way post-disaster is so important. So thank you for putting that on the slide, and thank you for being with us. We'll get back to you in the question and answer session. Now, Naraja, you work in Haiti on strengthening DRM and climate change resilience project. And as a TTL, you are working on integrating GBV prevention and response for women and girls before, during, and after a disaster, which is great. Thank you so much for doing that. How did you engage with the government of Haiti to prioritize this issue through your DRM project? And what would be your recommendations for teams who are hoping to do exactly what you're doing?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be in this panel. It's a very important topic that we need to keep talking about it. So let me first give you a little background of the project. So among other things, the project will train 140 communal committees of the civil protection. This means almost all the communes in the country. And the project is also building multi-purpose emergency shelters in 5 out of the 10 departments. And the design of these shelters will include considerations to reduce gender-based violence, such always the basics like separated toilets, more lights, better lights, and sufficient movable partitions to allow for more privacy for women and girls. And what is important to notice is that the members of these communal committees of the civil protection are the ones that are in charge of preparedness and are the first responders in the aftermath of a disaster. And some of them are also part of the emergency shelter management committees. So they are the ones who should make sure that women are safe in shelters, but unfortunately, sometimes they're also the perpetrators. So these in shelters, I mean, the dynamics can be very, very complex. And but anyway, we hope that by raising the awareness of these committees, on how to prevent GBV and how to address it, we hope to reduce the violence against women in shelters. And also today, through the project, we have included into the training material for all these committees from the civil protection nationwide to include a dedicated module to prevent and address GBV. And the trainings will start this month. And also, the firm currently is producing these shelter designs, and they are taking into consideration the different GBV recommendations. So also, in addition to this, the project is rated as having a high risk of GBV because we are building those shelters, and when there are workers that come into communities, that's also a risk. But the project has also developed all the measures necessary to prevent that. The PIU is giving also trainings to the different firms that are hired to build all of this, and they have the code of conduct. So we are working on both ends, on the project implementation per se, but also on how to reduce gender-based violence within the civil protection and in shelters. So the process to convince the governments to include GBV in the training models and in the shelter design was relatively a long process. I mean, everything started during the project preparation, and that started before I arrived in Haiti with the previous team that was working already here. But still today, with the team needs to keep having multiple discussions with the government, especially with the civil protection. We provided short trainings to key actors of the civil protection to really raise the awareness on all of this. So it's a constant dialogue that needs to be maintained. And today, the General Director of Civil Protection and also the Director for Protection are convinced and are also pursuing efforts to reduce GBV during emergencies. And we have the Director of the Civil Protection, of the Protection, sorry, is also the focal point for GBV. So this is also making a difference. So that means that within the civil protection, we have a focal point to work on these issues, and the PIU is directly working with this person. But we also did some assessments to better understand the extent of GBV during emergencies in shelter management managed by the civil protection. And we share those results with the government. Of course, results show that although the civil protection has established clear guidance to guarantee safety, unfortunately, shelters are not necessarily safe for women. So now, in terms of the challenges, although that Haiti has a legal framework to address GBV, had dedicated institutions, including within the civil protection, to address GBV, on the ground, we still need sustained support to make it happen, because it's just kind of just on paper, but not in the reality on the ground. So we need to still support not only in terms of awareness and knowledge, but also in terms of resources and adequate infrastructure to allow the civil protection to prevent and address GBV. One of the main challenges I see is how to keep this issue, the prevention of GBV, being a priority for the civil protection among many other competing priorities. So we need to keep reminding them that this is important, an important issue to consider. And even though we that needs to be on the table. Also, another challenge is how to really find practical ways to prevent GBV that are implementables and adapted to the local conditions, with a civil protection that is mostly comprised by volunteers. They don't really have a salary to work on all of this. It's just because they want to do it. And with very low resources and capacities, plus we are in a FCD context. So we need to find ways to work with these people on a way that is really at their level on things that they can do. And also we'll need to work with other organizations, local organizations from women or NGOs. And then as the previous speaker was talking about having this local collaboration, we need partnerships to really move this forward. So it's an effort that it needs to be done by many. In terms now of what recommendations I would give to teams is that first they really need to try to understand what is the issues on GBV in the country or the specific context where they're working, and share those results with the government, and maintain a sustained dialogue with the client on this. And also try to provide as much as possible trainings to key government staff, do consultations, meet with different actors on this, and to raise the awareness on these issues. And of course, the team, I mean, the best is to have a good gender specialist and GBV specialist, which luckily we do. And also just keep motivated and to discuss and bring this always to the table as an important topic.
Thank you so much, Naraya, and thank you for that point of kind of remaining engaged throughout the project. So you started kind of in the preparing the project, thinking about GBV, and it's something that you have to continue the dialogue and the attention with throughout the project. It's great that you're able to partner with GBV specialists within the bank and hopefully locally as well. So thank you so much for working on this in such a complex setting. But it also shows us that if you can do it in Haiti, we should be able to talk about doing it in other areas as well. So thank you so much. Now let's turn to Alex. Alex, UNFPA is the lead agency for addressing GBV in all humanitarian crises, including natural disaster related crises, as well as an agency that is deeply committed to addressing and eliminating all forms of GBV. Can you tell us a bit about the guiding principles and promising approaches that UNFPA follows and disseminates on addressing GBV in disaster settings? And then also you have some innovative work you are leading on the intersection between GBV and climate change. I want to hear from you how you think bank finance, preparedness, and emergency response operations can help complement the UN and other development partners' efforts in addressing GBV because of climate crisis. What are the opportunities for collaboration that you see at a global level, Alex? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Diana, and thank you very much for having us. We're really excited to be part of the broader conversation. I'll try and speak to everything in the short time frame, but I mean, I guess you know, as you say, we're leading on GBV responses in interventions in emergency settings in over 100 countries globally, and over around 150 countries and territories. We're supporting GBV more generally, so both in humanitarian but also in that development setting. And I think because we work across that entire kind of continuum, from emergency response into peace building, development, and then back around again, increasingly we're finding that it's critical for GBV interventions and programs and policies and laws to be able to pivot between all of those different contexts. So we have there are minimum standards, GBV and emergency minimum standards, which we apply to support preparedness and response, but also what we need to do in recovery. We then have a package called the Essential Services Package for women and girls subject to violence, and we use that in development settings. Knowing that these are two key kind of packages of work or minimum standards that we use, and recognizing the fact that we are moving in between different contexts on an ongoing basis, we're now working on a guideline which will basically bring those two pieces together and help our officers and also national stakeholders in understanding how to use those two different tools in a way that's going to be most effective. And that applies to both what it looks like, what a response looks like in an emergency setting, but also then how do we build to support much longer term sustainable systems and structures in the longer term development space. And we do this because we know with climate change, a key focus for us is going to be around ensuring the resilience and the adaptive capacity of women and girls as individuals, but also the systems, the health systems, the protection systems, the coordination and governance mechanisms, the laws and policies which guide those. We need to make sure that they're sufficiently strong and flexible to be able to make sure that we're actually responding to women and girls in the best way possible. I should also say, I've heard from some of the other speakers around how we really recognize the disproportionate impact of climate change and humanitarian crises on women and girls, and largely because of their limited access to resources. When we're talking about resources, we often equate that to income or livelihoods or poverty, and their experience of violence, being able to access services. But increasingly what we're understanding is that when we're talking about resources, we also need to consider those social and gendered norms which are driving those limited access to resources. You're part of UNFPA strategic plan for 2022-2025 is really about articulating the need to address those harmful norms as a way in which we can address that discrimination against women and girls, increase their capacity and resilience to climate change, but also apply those gender transformative principles to how we engage with systems and structures. Do we have health facilities in the right places? Do we have those facilities in places where women are going to be most affected by climate change, natural disaster, or security issues as a result of climate change? So increasingly really trying to understand and address the needs of individuals, but also systems and structures from that perspective. We also recognize that we do a lot of work around data and research in gender-based violence to help support evidence-based policies, laws, and interventions, both response and prevention work. We do this through a program called the Novo Data Initiative, which is all around capacity building for national stakeholders. So making sure national statistics officers are able and have capacity to safely and ethically collect national data on gender-based violence through the Demographic Health Survey or WHO Violence Against Women survey tools. But we also lead on the GBV as part of a broader steering committee of a range of different UN agencies and NGOs. The GBV information management system, which collects administrative data, so the incidence of violence. So between those, we can start to see what the systems and patterns look like associated with humanitarian responses, but also increasingly what that impact of climate change is going to start to look like. So, you know, there's a real need to continue to scale up that work around data and evidence so that we can understand the direct impact of climate change specifically. We also, I think one of the key sort of areas of work that we are increasingly advocating around and supporting is this idea of the power of localization. So the need to partner with and support sort of co-designed, co-implemented, co-evaluated program with feminist movements, and not just, you know, systems and structures and national stakeholders, but also those movements that are holding those systems accountable. It's really, really important that women in those affected communities have a voice, that they direct the services that they need. And for example, 39% of our funds last year went to local and national partners, just as an example of how important it is that we support those local organisations. We also worked with UNDRR and UN Women on a joint study last year on the status of gender equality and women's leadership in DRR. So really recognising that it's critical that we have that while women are most affected, they're also the key agents of change, both across humanitarian development, but in that climate change space as well.
Alex,
I'll cut off there.
I'm so sorry.
No,
you have so much to talk about. We clearly didn't give you enough time.
Not at all.
We'll come back to you in the question because there is a question that I think I want to ask you in the Q&A. But let me now turn to Jay. Thank you so much for being with us. Jay, USAID has financed the development of tools that help programs measure how climate crisis intersect with GBV and how to integrate GBV prevention interventions that best fit the emergency preparedness programs. Could you please take us through the results or the guidance that resulted from that investment, the lessons learned in developing this work, and what's on the horizon after this investment? What's next for USAID and GBV intersection between climate and GBV?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all again. It's so exciting to be on a panel with good friends and to hear about a topic area that USAID has invested in, and we've also been personally invested in looking at this intersection. So as Administrator Power has said, climate change is sexist, but our response shouldn't be. And that, quite frankly, has been the guiding principle for a lot of the work around gender-based violence and climate mitigation and climate change work. We are trying to, pulling from what Alex and other speakers have said throughout this panel, we're trying to work to enable and empower women as climate leaders in prioritizing the issues that impact them and their families and communities. While climate change is an enormous challenge for all people, women and girls, as you've heard, bear a disproportionate impact of the climate change and yet are underrepresented in decision-making processes related to climate change. So we put together, after so much evidence around this disproportionate impact, we recognized it in 2007 with Bangladesh and the cyclone that hit there. Deaths among women outnumbered men by 5 to 1. We recognized it in the disproportionate impact of environmental defenders, where, just from 2002 to 2022, there have been over 2,100 killings of environmental defenders, of which, the worst year was in 2020, where we really suspect with a lot of other NGOs that the number of women in particular that are defending their particular communities have been underreported. And so while looking at, the disproportionate impact of climate change and disaster on women and girls and children, and looking at, the impact of, the approach, the encroaching of land and other aspects of land by governments and private industry and others, really looking at these types of dimensions within that spectrum that really impact, again, women, girls, boys, and LGBTQI individuals and other marginalized communities. We started to put together with our partner of IUCN, wanting to do a deeper dive. We had so much anecdotal evidence. We were starting to get more data across all of the different entities that USAID is engaged with around, again, the disproportionate impacts. And so we went to our IUCN colleagues, and through the Advancing Gender and Environment mechanism called AGENT, to help us understand this wide landscape. So a few years ago, we published with IUCN a report on the intersection of gender-based violence and climate change. And I'll put it into the chat, the wealth of resources that we have now put together through this partnership to really uplift the voices and the work that women have been doing across the globe on climate change and ways to protect themselves and their families around gender-based violence. So one of the outcomes of this particular paper was we need to direct funding towards looking at this particular intersection. Now, there's been a lot of activities that have done this type of work before, but with the specific knowledge of wanting to collect evidence of what works, how do we make sure that we are funding and we are building the capacity of environmental organizations that have been saying for quite a number of decades that gender-based violence is an issue, yet they didn't know what to do, as well as gender-based violence women's rights organizations saying environmental issues are occurring, but we don't know how to get engaged in these discussions. So we put together a challenge called Resilient, Inclusive, Sustainable Environments, or RISE. And we've done this through a small grants mechanism. We are always looking for more partners to help us with funding small organizations. So let me just give you a couple of quick highlights from the RISE Challenge. We have funded, first of all, activities in Colombia, the DRC, Fiji, Guatemala, Kenya, Peru, Uganda, and Vietnam. The grantees are working on the intersection of GBV and land rights, or REDD+, sustainable farming, conservation, and artisanal mining. So we, for example, have been working with an indigenous organization named UTSCHE, which is indigenous-led in Guatemala, to address the root causes of gender-based violence faced by indigenous women, including economic, social, physical, and psychological insecurity. We have also funded ASEFA, which is in the DRC. It's a women-led Congolese organization to address gender-based violence and environmental degradation associated with artisanal mining in Eastern DRC. And one of the things that we have intentionally done through the RISE Challenge is work across these organizations to build the capacity and peer-to-peer mentorship. So we have artisanal mining organizations working in Colombia and talking with our DRC sisters to make sure that what is working there, can we take some of those pieces of working with the community and working with men and boys and the private sector, and same thing in Colombia. So I'll put, because we're running out of time, I'll put the website with all of the findings. We will just, in terms of the future, really quickly, we're looking to do a call for more grantees, probably late summer. And then we are also continuing to invest in more monitoring, evaluation, and really adaptation and supporting environmental organizations to bring on gender and gender-based violence experts to build out a stronger gender response to climate change. So with that, I look forward to the Q&A.
Yes, we have some really interesting questions come in. And I'd love, Che, how you said kind of this, that we have to work with the environmental groups and the GBV groups and bring them together. I think that's what we're trying to do at the bank, right? We have TTLs like John and Aya that are willing to engage in these conversations with their clients, recognize the importance, and now we're trying to support them with GBV specific expertise that some of us across the bank can support them with. So it's really necessary. It's good to see that it's being done on a macro level as well. We're trying to do it institutionally. And I think it really is the kind of the formula for the best success in doing this. So these questions are great. I am going to pick and choose. I'm so sorry to all of you who have asked questions, but there's one in particular that I think you can all talk to. And it's about the level of women's contribution in disaster preparedness stages and the decision-making system of how we set up disaster preparedness. Do you see globally an increase in women's contribution to this conversation, to the decision-making around disaster preparedness? And how could that affect GBV? Anyone want to come in on that point?
I mean, maybe to come in.
Alex, go ahead. I was thinking of you when I asked that.
Yeah, I think increasingly, I think with the principle around localization, I think with the Grand Bargain, I mean, even the Gender Action Plan under the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, there's been really strong drive towards ensuring that not just that women are represented in discussions, but there's actually a process of participation and active participation and capacity building to provide women with the right language and tools to be able to influence. So I think that's it is changing and it's significant. And it's significant because I think without having women at those decision-making tables, we just won't see the integration of issues around gender-based violence, for example, or sexual reproductive health. We just won't see that in the conversations. Last year, we did an analysis of 50 nationally determined contributions or national climate policies globally, and we had one mention of gender-based violence across all of those policies. So I think that's just representative of that urgent need to make sure that women and girls are sitting there and they have the capacity to engage in the right way. But again, it's not just about putting them at the table, it's about creating that space and making sure the women who are sitting at that space speak for women who are most affected as well.
Thank you. John, you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is such a good question, and it's sort of it's separate but interrelated issue, right? And this is something that the World Bank is really trying to support, across the world, but particularly in the East Asia and the Pacific. We have a lot of operations or projects that we're preparing at the moment that are seeking to reduce gender gaps on women's voice and agency. And we believe that the more knowledge that women have and women and girls have on disaster preparedness, the more, the greater their ability to prepare for future hazards. So this is something that's super important. Just a really quick segue as well. I think there was another question related to whether sexual violence, is legally punishable in certain current countries. And I think this awareness or lack of awareness of legislation is also something that we try to help, governments and women and girls, seek to understand better in our projects. So I think that's also a really important point that, yes, there are these legislations, there are these, policies, there are these punishments, but just like how we seek to invest in disaster risk reduction, we don't want to just, respond to the disasters. I think we should also be investing in GBV risk mitigation, mitigate the incidents before they even happen, educate people, both men and women, of what is actually a GBV, incident. I mean, we even had to try and change the language in Indonesia of women not feeling like victims, but actually survivors of GBV incidents. So I think this is all kind of interrelated. So I wanted to mention that quickly. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Naraya, over to you. But Before that, we have a question. I'll let you respond, but maybe you can also bring in any response that you would have on the difficulties between intergovernmental coordination around those who have to respond to GBV and disasters. Any advice on how to do that? Also, Jay, Alex, and John, if you have any reflections on that, and we'll close the panel with that question. Naraya, over to you.
Thank you. At least on the local level, for having more women involved in these committees from the civil protection, and also the committees that are the ones managing the shelters. I mean, we hope that by bringing women to the table, that they will also take these issues at hand. But I think that is not only a matter of having women participating, but also women that are aware that this is not something acceptable, and that they can really have the tools to really fight against it. Because my impression is that, at least in this society and many poor countries, that women, they even don't realize that this is not something that is bad. I mean, they just like, it's normal because it happens so often. All the sisters, mothers, I mean, there's such a big level of violence that it's almost normal, and I don't think it's something they need to be fight against. So it's important to women's have participation of women, but at the same time that they have the means to fight for it. And then in terms of the coordination, it's very complicated, I think, because normal institutions, they don't necessarily talk to each other. And it's you need to have these focal points on the national level, but also on the local level. And it's a big effort to try to make them communicate. So we need to really try to generate platforms for communication among the government. It's not an easy task, but it's something that needs to be done really proactively, because otherwise it not necessarily happens.
Yeah, we have to invest in coordination. Thank you, Naraya, for bringing that point and for bringing out that sometimes violence against women and girls in many of our communities is normalized. It talks to what Alex said about challenging those social norms that make it acceptable to use violence against women, and unchallenged, really. Thank you, all of you, so much for such an interesting discussion. I hope we've inspired TTLs at the bank and researchers and others who joined us today to really continue to invest in this space, to see it grow with investments of UNFPA and USAID, to follow the work of the bank and pioneering TTLs like John and Naraya. Thank you so much for being with us. Now I'm going to hand over very quickly to Zoe. Zoe, I'm so sorry. Let me pull up your bio to introduce you properly. Zoe Trojanis is currently a lead disaster risk management specialist working in GFDRR with more than 18 years of experience at the bank in disaster risk management and urban development. Thank you for joining us and giving us some closing remarks. Over to you.
No, I just am so thrilled to be here. I think, especially from the GFDRR, which is the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, we have a new strategy which runs from 2021 through 2025. And one of our cross-cutting themes is precisely on inclusive disaster risk management and gender equality. And this issue of gender-based violence, as we've heard from all the speakers, is a pervasive issue that needs to be addressed, and just shining a light, I think, and talking about it is important, and hearing what different groups, including the World Bank, can do, and all the entry points and the good practices and the not so good practices, and the hard conversations and the challenges that we all are facing, dealing with, government stakeholders, coordination issues, as we heard from several speakers. But I think it's a road we have to take, and we will take, especially at the World Bank. And I think documenting these experiences is critical, and raising awareness, the data point, the issue around leadership and engagement that we heard about today. So I just want to thank you all. I know we ran over by a minute, but I also want to say this is the first of, I'm sure, additional conversations on this topic and the broader issue on gender equality and disaster risk management. And I think what Gian mentioned is very important, that we bear in mind. Of course, today we focus quite a bit on emergency preparedness and post-disaster response and recovery. but this goes beyond, this issue should really be integrated across the spectrum of disaster risk management activities, right? Not just post-disaster. So this is something I think we can challenge ourselves to do. And I also think working, of course, closely between the disaster risk management within the World Bank Social and the gender group is critical. So thanks again to you all. I know everybody's got to run. Thanks so much to our speakers, panelists, to all the participants. Great to see you all. And we will, as Diana mentioned in the chat, we will post online. We've recorded the discussion and we will include the PowerPoints. And thanks to our speakers for including also lots of links to different resources. So we'll be sure to do that. And then we're planning hopefully to follow up with a guidance note in our next fiscal year with the gender group and GFDRR to look more into these issues and in coordination with our other partners, as we heard from, to sort of bring together that experience. So thanks everybody. Yay, great to see you all. Have a great day. Have a good night, Gian. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.